many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time. Before their time.
I'm going to talk about COVID. Now, when we first heard about this global pandemic coming our way, I didn't take it very seriously. I've heard a lot of dire predictions that didn't come to much, and I thought this would be similar. Obviously, I was wrong. And though it hasn't turned out, touch wood, disaster movie apocalyptic in terms of loss of life, it certainly has been apocalyptic in terms of our way of life. In this video, I will show how theoretical history can help make sense of what is happening, and also how some theoretical historians in fact saw it coming. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, many people sense that we are in the midst of major changes and that the world is transitioning to some kind of new normal. You have people like Bill Gates comparing the pandemic to the Second World War and saying that it should lead to new world institutions for a fairer, healthier world. And the Prince of Wales calling for a great reset, which he explains on his website is about building back better for more sustainable business practices. I will show how much of what we are going through has happened before, and I will discuss how, according to theoretical history, the pandemic is part of a deepening crisis that will unfold over the coming years, with more disease, war, famine, flood, and eventually the emergence of a new world historical era. To begin with, is the pandemic a plandemic or scamdemic, as some people claim? Are lockdowns sensible precautions preventing things from getting worse, or are they ludicrously disproportionate to a threat that is minuscule to most healthy people? Is the pandemic an excuse for technocratic globalists to track us and control us, robbing us of our freedoms? Is it a deliberate attempt to reduce the world's population? Or is it mass hysteria, or just incompetence? Well, I don't know. If it were just in one country, it might make sense to put it down to government incompetence or a sinister conspiracy. But it's hard to believe in an organised plot or to blame it on particular politicians when the whole world is acting in the same way, including countries that don't seem to be on the same side, like Russia, China, and the West. What we can say is that pandemics do bring out these kinds of conspiracy theory. When there was cholera in Paris in the 1830s, it was said that the authorities spread it deliberately to cut down the numbers of poor. The government ordered the cleaning up of the streets, and there were riots because people made a living from picking through the rubbish. There was rioting during a cholera outbreak in Astrakhan in the 1880s. The government had ordered a large number of coffins, and this was seen as suspicious. During cholera in Glasgow, doctors were accused of spreading the disease because they wanted more bodies to dissect, and an ambulance was attacked. When bubonic plague hit northern China in the 1920s, Dr. Wu, who was in charge of controlling the outbreak, was said to be poisoning the water supply and shooting the victims behind the hospital walls. In the Middle Ages, Jews were accused of infecting wells, and during the 1918 influenza it was said that German submarines were transmitting the infection around the United States. The idea that governments exploit pandemics to justify extending their control over the population is also common. In the late 19th century, the colonial authorities in British India were accused of using cholera outbreaks for imperialist reasons to justify inspecting goods and restrict population movements. One British official who enforced the restrictions with particular brutality was assassinated. In 1902, the American authorities in the Philippines burned villages and relocated their populations, supposedly to control a cholera outbreak, but it was seen as no coincidence that they mainly targeted villages that had supported a recent rebellion. Rumours and wild speculations are kind of a natural product of fear and uncertainty when people are trying to make sense of confusing situations with inadequate information. So today you can find videos on YouTube, or more probably on BitChute because the users have been banned from YouTube, saying that the pandemic is a deliberate bioweapon and that it's to reduce population and extend government control. But just bear in mind that pandemics always attract such theories, and they are predictable in that sense. I'm not saying these ideas are definitely wrong. I have an open mind towards conspiracy theories, and you can find my other videos suggesting that we probably are moving towards a technocratic collectivist world of intensive surveillance and control. You could say that the existence of these conspiracy theories shows that we really are, to some extent, being kept in the dark, because if everything were transparent, it would actually make logical sense, and there would be no reason or room for conspiracy theories. And in fact, we shouldn't expect the exact truth, because how a country is coping with the pandemic is, in a way, a state secret. The disease can affect a country's geopolitical readiness, for example, if the army is locked down, and also its economic well-being, for example, if people stop wanting trade goods from a country that's believed to be pestilential. In the past, governments have covered up epidemics for such reasons. In 1910, when there was cholera in Naples, the city authorities kept it quiet. China tried to do the same with SARS in 2003. Then, when the information does leak out, the authorities can go the other way, taking draconian measures as if to persuade other countries that they have the situation under control and everything is fine. When the plague appeared in Hong Kong in 1894 and the news leaked out, it threatened Hong Kong's export trade. So the British colonial authorities started burning people's furniture and cleaning neighbourhoods with carbolic acid. This led to riots and accusations of British racism against the Chinese, who lived in the poor and crowded districts where this occurred. With COVID-19, the Chinese authorities seem to be equally draconian, with stories, for example, of people being barricaded in their apartments. Perhaps today there are advantages in exaggeration or overreaction, maybe as a rehearsal for something worse, or maybe following Sun Tzu's advice in The Art of War to appear strong when you are weak and appear weak when you are strong. So states aren't necessarily going to be candid about how they are doing, because a pandemic can be seen as a test of a society. In the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire was struck by a pandemic known as the Antonine Plague, after the Antonine emperors who were ruling at the time. Some historians see this as the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire. Depopulation from the disease, which was probably smallpox, meant the Romans had to rely increasingly on barbarians who migrated into the empire from across the frontier and were recruited into the army. In other words, the Romans could no longer defend themselves, and powerful barbarian families arose who would eventually break up the empire into a set of private kingdoms. So that's the story, and well, fair enough, but the Roman writer Livy describes a whole series of epidemics affecting Rome during its early days. And those epidemics didn't stop it from conquering its neighbours and building up a mighty empire. Why was the Antonine Plague different? Because by then Rome was already past its prime. The problem of disease didn't change. What changed was Rome's ability to take it in its stride. So with the Antonine Plague, there is some evidence that the population had begun declining before it even arrived. When Rome was vigorous and growing, it recovered from pandemics quite easily. But later on, when it had reached the limit of its potential, a pandemic was a serious blow. It's the same story later on with the plague that arrived in the AD 500s when the Emperor Justinian was on the throne. By this time, the Western Roman Empire was already broken up, but the eastern part of the empire, the Byzantine Empire, was actually making progress reconquering it. Then the plague arrived. It's believed to have been the bubonic plague, the same as the Black Death that hit Europe in the Middle Ages. And it caused sickness, depopulation, famine, and economic collapse as people abandoned the farms and merchants and shops could no longer function. And this basically stopped the reconquest in its tracks, or so some historians argue, because the reconquest was abandoned at that time, and the Roman Empire never would be reunited. And yet the plague didn't stop the Arab armies who were at that time building their Islamic empire all the way from Spain to modern Pakistan. What was the difference? Well, one, Islam was a young, vigorous, growing civilization, and the other, Byzantium, was old, sluggish, and easily knocked off course. So it follows that how a country copes with COVID-19 tells you how it is doing in general, whether it is dynamic and on its way up in the world, or whether it is getting feeble and on its way down. You can imagine that each country is looking at how its geopolitical rivals deal with the pandemic and is drawing conclusions about what kind of a challenge they are going to present in the economic and strategic struggles of the coming years. COVID-19 is an audit of every society it affects, providing information about its national capabilities and about the cohesion and determination of its population, or alternatively whether the population is divided and on the verge of rebellion. Because COVID is not just a health threat, it's also an economic threat. And this is where a lot of people wonder what is going on, because so much of the economic damage seems self-inflicted. Shutting down vast areas of economic activity, then running up government debt to support those who can't work, seems crazily unsustainable. Is the cure going to be worse than the disease? Falls in economic output have been massive. Vital industries are being driven to bankruptcy. Airlines, entertainment, high street shops. It seems we're in danger of collapsing countless firms, big and small, and throwing vast swathes of the population out of work. It's hard to imagine how the economy can recover anytime soon from this kind of assault on it. But in fact, lockdowns and economic destruction are the usual accompaniment of pandemics. Consider these regulations issued by the Italian city of Pistoia during the Black Death in 1348. No citizen of Pistoia shall in any way dare or presume to go to Pisa or Lucca, and no one can or ought to come from either of them on penalty of £50, and no person shall dare or presume in any way to bring to the city of Pistoia either linen or wool for use as clothing, on penalty of £200. The regulations also imposed restrictions on food markets and limited attendance at funerals to the immediate family. When the plague hit London in 1665, there were restrictions on funerals. Houses where plague occurred were barricaded for 6 weeks with the inhabitants inside, and their food and drink was supplied out of local taxes. Samuel Pepys, who lived in London at the time, panicked when one of his servants had a headache, and he had him bundled out of the house in case they were all put in lockdown. Luckily, it was a false alarm and the servant was fine. Sometimes neighbours forced open barricaded houses to let the people inside escape. There were restrictions on food sales. When it was first heard that plague had broken out in the Netherlands, a travel ban was imposed, though it didn't stop the plague getting through. In Shakespeare's day, in the 1500s, there were regular plague epidemics in London, and the theatres were often closed down by the authorities, preventing Shakespeare and his colleagues from making a living. In Romeo and Juliet, the letter that was supposed to warn Romeo that Juliet was only faking her death didn't get through because the messenger passed through a city just as plague broke out, and he was put in lockdown. Obviously that's fiction, but it shows it was part of life. Throughout history, from at least late Roman times, you'll see that epidemics led to travel being restricted, shops being shut, factories closed, bathhouses locked. The idea of quarantine from the Italian for 40 originated during the Black Death, when merchant ships were forced to wait 40 days to prove they were plague-free before being allowed to unload their goods. In later centuries, the British criticised this because they saw it as a hindrance to free trade. Many doctors thought plague was spread by miasmas, meaning invisible clouds of bad air that floated over the landscape. And so they said quarantine was unnecessary because the idea that plague could be spread by human contact was just primitive superstition. During the 1918 influenza, shops in the US were placed on restricted opening hours, and there was some kind of rota system to limit the number of people in the high street. With COVID, the restrictions have gone further, shutting shops entirely, but now there is online shopping to compensate. In 1918, some US cities also made mask wearing compulsory in public, and later the city councils were sued by citizens groups who said that masks were degrading, ineffective, and positively unhealthy. So restrictions on travel, trade, and social interaction are quite normal for pandemics, as is resistance and criticism from the general public. And there is an argument that restrictions don't do as much economic damage as might be expected, because during times of pestilence, people avoid human contact anyway. During the Plague of London, a few alehouses remained open, but people were afraid to go there. So it's not that there isn't economic damage, but a pandemic causes a lot of economic damage by itself, and government restrictions don't make it that much worse. For COVID, some people have crunched the numbers on this, comparing Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, which had different lockdown policies, and they've shown that more stringent lockdowns didn't cause much more economic contraction. And in past pandemics, you had large numbers of people ill and dying, which would obviously harm economic activity in itself. Traditionally, the Black Death is supposed to have killed a third of the population. You can imagine the economic effects of that. But economies and societies are extremely resilient. Life carried on. Growth and progress eventually resumed. It's not to say that it wasn't without a lot of pain at the time, but it wasn't the end of the world. And the bounce back can be surprisingly rapid. Think about how Europe was engulfed in total war from 1939 to 1945. Not only was economic effort massively diverted into armaments and military uniforms, while governments ran up huge debts, but a large part of the economically productive population was away fighting. Factories and city centres were being bombed to smithereens, and European trade and commerce came to a halt. The economic wreckage caused by something like that is beyond belief. Yet by the 1950s, things were on the way up, and Germany, despite being defeated and destroyed, was beginning a long economic boom. However scary the economic fallout of COVID, it's likely to be a blip in long-term perspective. Yes, it's painful to live through, but we shouldn't lose hope. Now, let's think a bit more about pandemics, what causes them, and what effects they have on history. In his book, Plagues and Peoples, the historian William McNeill talks about the confluence of disease pools. Pandemics have occurred when human populations become better connected, and the diseases of one population flow into the other. Diseases need a critical mass of people in order to sustain themselves, and connections between people build them into that critical mass. If there are not enough people connected together, soon everyone nearby has been infected and the disease has nowhere to go, so it dies out. But if the population is well connected, it can keep on spreading to new victims despite people's attempt to avoid it. Add to this that people's immune systems get used to germs they see every day, but they are vulnerable to germs they have not come across before. This is why people get ill when they drink water on holiday, even though the locals drink it quite happily. So the problem is when populations become newly connected and they are exposed to each other's germs for the first time. The classic example is when Europeans discovered the Americas, taking with them diseases like measles and smallpox that didn't exist in the New World. The Native Americans were absolutely devastated, maybe a population reduction of 90% over the next century or so, a big factor in helping Europeans take over their lands. On the other hand, because America was smaller and less connected as a population, it didn't have much in the way of diseases to transmit back, although it's traditionally thought that syphilis was at least one disease that came from America to Europe. What William McNeill shows is that every time there was an increase in the connectedness of the human race, it unleashed some kind of pandemic, as a disease from one place was able to rip through the whole world. So we can go back to the Bronze Age around 2000 BC, when it's recently been discovered there was an outbreak of bubonic plague that killed off most of the population of Europe and allowed new peoples to invade Europe from the east, much like Europeans would later do to the New World. And the factor responsible for this was the domestication of the horse, which made people much more mobile and brought previously isolated populations into contact, i.e., there was more connectedness. Another big step up in connectedness was in the early Roman Empire after the birth of Christ. This involved the opening up of the Silk Roads between China and the West, and improved understanding of how monsoon winds worked, which greatly increased trade across the Indian Ocean. And it was this new connectedness that produced the Antonine Plague. The same applies for the Plague of Justinian. This came after an expansion of the Silk Route, with new roads being opened up, and also when Islamic conquests were connecting huge swathes of Eurasia under one seamless empire. As for the Black Death, it came after the conquests of Genghis Khan, once again connecting a large part of the world under the Mongol Empire, with mounted armies moving over the vast space from China to the Ukraine. Then in the 19th century, the European colonial empires brought another step up in global connectedness, and they provided the conduit by which cholera spread from India across the world. Even something like AIDS in the 1980s can be attributed to the rise of cheap jet travel and increased tourism between the US and the Caribbean, connecting these populations more closely than before. What about COVID? Well, it seems related to the opening up of China since the 1980s and its emergence as a hub of the world economy. China is a huge manufacturing centre. It is the operator of the world's highest capacity container ports. It is promoting the Belt and Road Initiative, the so-called New Silk Road, a network of ports, motorways and railways stretching across Eurasia and even to Africa. Clearly a big step up in global connectedness. It's hardly surprising there has been a global pandemic, and indeed that it came from China. The theoretical historian Peter Turchin showed back in 2007 that over the last few millennia there has been a series of, as he called them, waves of integration, connecting, then partially disconnecting the east and west ends of Eurasia. As part of this, there have been waves of disease, with their peak occurring close to the peak of connectedness. This chart of fluctuations in pandemics since the Middle Ages is from Peter Turchin's chapter in the book Globalization as Evolutionary Process. The model is like this. The cycle starts with populations in Eastern and Western Eurasia being relatively small and with few connections between them. There may be a bit of disease in each population, but it's at a low level. These small, healthy populations do well and begin to grow until they reach the point of overpopulation. They then start to put pressure on local resources. People feel poorer. This makes them more adventurous, and they reach out across the world island looking for opportunities, making contacts, and building trade routes. And this has two effects. First, the larger populations create the critical mass that allows disease to flourish, particularly because larger, denser, overstretched populations mean more people living in cities, often in poor and unsanitary conditions. Then, second, the connections create what William McNeill called the confluence of disease pools. So pathogens can reach populations with low resistance and spread through them like wildfire. The result is depopulation and collapse of trade networks. And as populations shrink and connectedness decreases, that puts an end to epidemics because there's no critical mass, no confluence of disease pools, and no low resistance populations. Eventually, the cycle begins again. The appearance of COVID-19 suggests we are at the peak of such a disease cycle, and the next thing to expect is that population will fall and connectedness will unravel. As one writer says, if Turchin is right, globalization ought to be about to go into reverse. So the spread of disease depends on human connectedness, and that means it's usually the richest areas, which are the ones with the most connections, that are the hardest hit. The Black Death arrived in England at Weymouth on the south coast. From there it spread 100 miles north and east to Oxford and London, and it jumped along the coast to Exeter. But areas in between were little affected, and if the plague reached them, it did so much later. Why? Because Oxford, London and Exeter were important trading centres with large populations. That was where the human traffic was going and carrying the disease along with it. These other areas might have been closer, but they were rural districts composed of sleepy villages where strangers were hardly seen from one week to the next. The part of England that suffered the worst outbreak of the Black Death was also the richest, Suffolk, and that is because it was at the centre of trade between England and the continent. Its large, active markets attracted people from all over England and from across the North Sea. It was a hub of economic exchange and human interaction, and as a result, it was a sitting target for the disease. You can see the same effect today. This chart plots each country's GDP, gross domestic product, against the size of its outbreak as of October 2020. Clearly, there is a correlation. GDP is a measure of wealth, and it's also a measure of connectedness. Wealth means trade, commerce, and economic interaction. And so a country's GDP tells you a lot about its importance in global interaction networks. So this is why the most populous and well-off countries tend to have the largest outbreaks. Not because they are somehow handling the situation worse than, say, these countries in Africa, like Botswana and what have you, but because the disease goes where the action is, which is to metropolises like London and New York City, where people gather from all over the world, and there is a constant throughput of carriers and potential victims. These African countries are like the sleepy villages of the Middle Ages, off the beaten track, not at the centre of things, and so their outbreaks are correspondingly light. Now, I've been talking about the pandemic, but a pandemic should never be considered in isolation. It's always part of a bigger picture, and typically it occurs in conjunction with war, civil unrest, financial stresses, natural disasters, and more disease. When the Black Death reached Europe in 1348, it came at the end of what Bruce Campbell describes in his book The Great Transition as one of the most difficult decades of the Middle Ages. The St. Magdalene flood in 1342, 6 years before the Black Death, was the worst flood in Central Europe of the last 1,000 years. In the January before the Black Death arrived, there was an earthquake in the Alps that was felt from Naples to Bavaria. In her book A Distant Mirror, Barbara Tuchman calls that whole period the calamitous 14th century. This was a time of climate change when the medieval warm period had ended and Europe's climate was getting cooler and wetter. This meant, besides floods, later and less certain harvests. Heavy rains led to famine in 1315 to 1317 and again in 1329 to 1330. There was a cattle plague wiping out farm animals across Europe between 1314 and 1325. As a result, Europe's population was declining for decades before the Black Death even arrived. The mortality from the Black Death just contributed to population decline that was already in progress, and the population would keep crashing up to at least the middle of the next century. This was the time of the 100 Years' War between England and France, as well as other wars in Italy and Germany. There were economic problems. International trade was stagnating and national outputs were falling. Italian banks collapsed as the economy contracted and kings defaulted on their loans. After the Black Death, there were uprisings in various parts of Europe, the Jacquerie in France, the Ciompi in Italy, and the Peasants' Revolt in England. And to add to the misery, the plague returned at roughly 10-year intervals, though becoming less severe and less frequent. And it wasn't just Europe. China experienced a similar constellation of calamities, not just the plague, but climate fluctuations, problems with the rice harvest, floods, earthquakes, locust swarms, overtaxation, inflation, and then the rebellions and wars that led to the collapse of the Yuan dynasty and the rise of the Ming dynasty. So the Black Death was not an isolated problem, but was part of a sea of troubles. And the same is true of other pandemics. They were part of what we can call a complex crisis. The 10 plagues of Egypt are a classic example of this. Plague 5 was a cattle epidemic. Plague 6, boils. Plague 10, death of the firstborn. So you have diseases of humans and livestock. Plague 8 was locusts. Plague 1 was the Nile running red. And Plague 7 was hailstorms, so climatic and environmental disasters. And Plague 9, 3 days of darkness, suggests some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps a volcanic eruption or a meteor impact. And on top of that, you had the rebellion of the Hebrews and disaster as the Pharaoh's army was swallowed up by the Red Sea. Now, this might all seem quite legendary, yet there are arguments that it could refer to real events. The fact that it involves not just one plague in isolation, but a whole complex crisis, to me makes it quite realistic, and more likely that it is not a made-up story, but a distorted memory of something that really happened. The Antonine Plague occurred when Germanic tribes were attacking across the Rhine, and the population of the Roman Empire was probably already declining. The situation deteriorated over the next 100 years, so the Roman Empire came very close to collapse, only being saved by the reforms of Diocletian, who became emperor in AD 284. Next, the plague of Justinian arrived during the wars to reconquer the Western Empire, and it was accompanied by famines, floods, and population decline unravelling over several decades. Similarly, 19th century cholera outbreaks in Europe often occurred in conjunction with rebellion and revolution, and the 1918 influenza, of course, came at the end of the First World War. So a pandemic is part of a syndrome of problems. The same seems to be true today. COVID is one of a series of pandemic scares since 2000, including SARS, MERS, Ebola, and H1N1 swine flu. There was also the foot and mouth outbreak of 2001 in the UK. There's been unrest, particularly in the US, and also in other Western countries. And these societies seem more polarized than ever. World population is not yet in decline, but its growth is screeching to a halt. A decade ago, the financial system weathered the crisis of 2008, and it still seems overextended with debt levels higher than ever. There have been floods and plagues of locusts. Of course, the world is always experiencing crises and disasters, so it isn't difficult to assemble such a list. Nevertheless, some of these observations have substance behind them, such as with Peter Turchin's detailed analysis of trends in the US over the last couple of 100 years, and a similar analysis other researchers have done for the UK. The bottom line is that COVID-19 seems to be part of a wider series of challenges to contemporary global civilization. So could war, particularly World War, be part of the unfolding complex crisis to which COVID-19 belongs? Well, the psychologist Steven Pinker argues in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that violence has declined throughout history. He pointed out that there has been a long peace since the end of the Second World War, and he said that big wars are now a thing of the past. According to him, there are three things that mean a world war could no longer happen. They are, firstly, that we have international organizations like the United Nations to resolve disputes peacefully. Second, the countries today are too interdependent through trade. And third, more and more countries are democracies. But the political scientist Aaron Klause has shown that the lull in big wars since the middle of the 20th century is not statistically significant. There have been such long gaps before. If it went on for another 150 years, we would have to say something definitely has changed. But right now there is no statistical reason to think that big wars are over. What's more, the things that Steven Pinker talks about are not guaranteed. In fact, they are arguably going into reverse, and COVID-19 is a part of that. So Steven Pinker talks about international organizations, but the credibility of international organizations has declined during the pandemic, with the US withdrawing from the World Health Organization and militias around the world basically ignoring the UN's call for a pandemic ceasefire. Steven Pinker highlights economic interdependence, but the pandemic has forced countries into isolation, shrinking international trade and reducing interdependence. And Steven Pinker mentions democracy, but the pandemic may have compromised democracy, with the UN speaking of a toxic lockdown culture in which authoritarian regimes are using the pandemic as an excuse to strengthen their control. And what's important is that just as with population decline being already underway before the Black Death arrived, so these things didn't start with COVID-19. The pandemic is contributing to trends that were already in progress. International organizations were already weakening, with the US reducing its commitment to NATO, for example, and the UK leaving the European Union. World trade was losing its momentum before COVID emerged, and nationalist anti-democratic sentiment was said to be on the rise around the world. So, in short, the factors Steven Pinker says will prevent war are ceasing to apply. And if the pandemic is part of a complex crisis, as has been the case in the past, then it's reasonable to think that war is on the cards. Now, it's not really a mystery why pandemics should be part of a broader syndrome. It's because these other problems all have their roots in the same population growth and increased connectedness that create opportunities for disease. Larger populations pressing harder on their resources are impoverished, and that creates the unhappiness and resentment that lead to civil unrest. Countries that are interacting more vigorously while being in increasingly intense competition for resources are also likely to experience friction and rivalry, which can end in open conflict and eventually war. Growth of global connectedness brings increasingly complex financial networks that are not tried and tested, making them vulnerable to the stresses caused by differential economic development or by changing tastes and commercial opportunities. And the heightened connectedness of the financial system means that a problem in one sector can rip through the global banking system, causing a huge crash, the same way a pandemic can rip through the population. Natural disasters stem similarly from the same underlying problem, because, flooding is a natural phenomenon. It only becomes a disaster when people build their homes in the places where flooding occurs. Earthquakes are only a problem when people choose to live in fault zones. And people who actually live in such areas for a long time develop ways of coping. But if population has been increasing rapidly, then people start moving into areas that were previously avoided, such as floodplains and earthquake zones. And being inexperienced with them, they are vulnerable to the problems that occur there. Similarly with climate change, it's the same underlying problem of rapid increases in connectedness. Anyone who knows history knows that the climate is always changing, It's only a problem when societies become overextended and over-specialized so that they lose their ability to adapt. So, to summarize, increased connectedness produces a whole range of negative effects. Disease is one, and so are conflict, financial instability, and environmental stress. And they all occur together in a multiple whammy or complex crisis. Now, having said all this, the real problem is not connectedness per se, it is that this level of connectedness is reached without there being the social institutions that are capable of handling the stress that such connectedness produces. Take a concrete example. In the world today, we have the World Health Organization, and as its name implies, it is supposed to be looking after world health. But COVID-19 shows it's not really succeeding. And we also have national health systems, which do a reasonable job of looking after the health of individual nations. But they are seemingly not up to the job of resolving a global health crisis, which is above their level of competence and responsibility. So we've got national organisations that aren't designed for a global problem, and a global organisation that doesn't really have the power, the budget, or the personnel to be much more than a talking shop and conduct some limited vaccination and health education programs. What we need is a World Health Organization that is to the world what national health organizations are to individual countries. But we don't have that. So we could say that the problem is not that the world is connected, but that it is connected without the kind of health institutions such a connected world needs. And as another example, we have the United Nations that is supposed to manage conflict between countries and keep the peace. But there's still a lot of violence in the world. As a world government, the United Nations is pretty ineffective. Again, the world is connected enough to generate a lot of friction and conflict, and yet it doesn't have the institutions that could process and resolve that conflict. So the problem is not connectedness as such, but over-connectedness, a degree of connectedness that is beyond what the human race has so far learned to cope with. The result is that the initial response to a complex crisis is fragmentation. There's too much connectedness for the institutions that exist, so the world becomes more disconnected. Trade contracts, war divides countries from each other, internal unrest and environmental problems cause societies to turn inwards. All different kinds of fragmentation. But that's just the initial response. The long-term response is to move towards better and more powerful institutions so that the world can return to the original level of connectedness, but this time with the capacity to manage that connectedness. And it's the complex crisis with all the problems that it brings that gives people the motivation to improve their institutions. Because it's not something they necessarily want to do. Many people are wary of giving up power to global institutions like the World Health Organization and the United Nations. But the complex crisis wears down their resistance, and it makes them feel that there has to be a better way of doing things. We've seen this with the evolution of the United Nations. After the Napoleonic Wars came the Concert of Europe. in which the heads of various European states agreed to work together to prevent war. That worked for a while, but ended up in World War I, out of which came the League of Nations, a more formal organisation for keeping the peace. That also failed when World War II broke out, but World War II and the years of senseless destruction that it involved spurred countries on to create the even more advanced United Nations. And even the US, which didn't join the League of Nations, decided it had to get involved. And you can imagine that the pandemic will lead people to feel that the world needs a more effective kind of health organization, as people like Bill Gates are calling for. And if one pandemic doesn't do it, further pandemics may well do it. What this means is that the complex crisis of which a pandemic is part leads eventually to a major reorganization of society, which comes when people have had enough of all the troubles and decide to work out better ways of getting along with each other. This means new political, economic, and cultural institutions that can manage the stresses of a highly complex and highly connected world. And this reorganization of society can be perceived as a change of historical era. So after the Black Death and the calamities of the 14th century, within another 100 years, the Middle Ages came to an end and the world moved into the modern era with the invention of the printing press, the beginning of modern industrial civilization, and with the discovery of the Americas when the world came to be understood as a whole. Similarly, the plague of Justinian occurred around the time that historians recognize as the end of antiquity and the beginning of the medieval era. And so it can be regarded as part of a complex crisis that produced this transition. The Antonine Plague also marked a change of era from the classical Roman Empire to the late Roman Empire. This was when Christianity began to take off and the character of Roman civilization changed, with former barbarians becoming generals, ministers, and eventually emperors. In the same way, we should expect COVID-19 to be a precursor of some kind of historical transition. For this, I would look to the historian Leonard Grinin's concept of production principles, each of which goes through 6 historical stages. According to this, we moved from the industrial principle to the information-cybernetic principle in the 1950s with the invention of the transistor. And we entered the second stage of this principle in the 1990s with the rise of the internet. Leonard Grinin expects that we will move to the third stage in the period 2030 to 2040, and that will likely involve the rise of artificial intelligence taking over many jobs currently done by humans, and a massive expansion of the human presence in space, moving towards the vision of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, who dream of colonizing Mars and having millions of people in orbiting space factories. This is going to be a transition as big as the Industrial Revolution, fundamentally changing how people live and work. Now, the pandemic is just one of a whole set of problems and doesn't itself cause the change of era. What it can do is catalyze the adjustments that are needed. For example, during the pandemic, governments have taken responsibility for maintaining people's incomes with furlough schemes. And this has led to revival of ideas about a universal basic income, which people would receive automatically and which they could then top up by working. It has been suggested that something like this will be needed when artificial intelligence takes over jobs. So the pandemic has been a bit of an experiment in what this might look like, and perhaps made it a little more thinkable. As another example, the pandemic has drastically cut traffic between countries, making the world less international and more inward-looking. And in this way, it is producing the fragmentation that is the first response to overconnectedness. And this applies within countries too, as lockdowns and isolation are reducing the amount of human interaction. And one of the effects of this is to wake people up to the value of devolved technologies and local self-reliance, as opposed to dependence on complex, far-flung networks and people far away. At the same time, climate change, which is part of the complex crisis, is encouraging the abandonment of fossil fuels. And it doesn't matter what you think about climate change, but the abandonment of fossil fuels is precisely what you would expect for a world leaving the industrial era. And this is being made up for in part with solar power, which supports local power generation. Every house can have its own solar panels, and solar power is also ideal for use in space. So this is a way in which the complex crisis is bringing about the transition Leonard Grinin talks of, from the old industrial world to the new information-cybernetic era of AI and space exploitation. And the pandemic contributes to and helps catalyse the change by forcing people to isolate and making them more aware of the need for local solutions. We can also see this in the way the pandemic is moving us to a more virtual online world. Technologies like video conferencing already existed, but they weren't used so much as people still went to the office and preferred to meet face to face. But the pandemic has changed this, and people have become used to the possibilities of Zoom and things like that. The pandemic is helping shift us from the old industrial era paradigm of getting on a bus and going to work to the new futuristic paradigm of remote teleworking and virtual teams. It's the same with high street shops. Lockdowns have been a disaster for ordinary retailers who have been forced to close their shops, but it has been good for online retailers. The pandemic is helping to catalyse a move from physical bricks and mortar shopping to virtual shopping. And of course, people are sentimental about it. They don't want to lose their high streets. And Jeff Bezos and Amazon have come in for a lot of criticism, which is why you need a complex crisis to achieve historical transformation. People tend to stick with what they are comfortable with, and change has to be forced upon them. Because the genius of Amazon is that it's not just a store, it's actually a portal. There is someone who advertises on YouTube, Sophie Howard is her name, and she runs courses on how you can make money through Amazon. She describes Amazon as a huge river of wealth, and she says that Amazon gives you the chance to dip your bucket in that stream. There is Amazon Marketplace and Fulfilled by Amazon, and these allow you to list your products on Amazon and even have Amazon warehouse them and ship them to your customers on your behalf. This is not an infomercial for Amazon, by the way. I'm just talking about the technology and its social implications. So a lot of people are making money through Amazon, and it's also making work, for example, for all the freelance delivery drivers. And yes, the high street shops are likely to go out of business and everything will be centralized through Amazon. But this kind of centralization has been going on for some time. There used to be no such thing as a supermarket, but supermarkets came along and put the village butcher and baker out of business because it made economic sense after technological advances like the motor car and refrigeration reduced the costs and increased the benefits of shopping in town. So the decline of the high street and the rise of online shopping are moving us into the future, transforming the way we live. And those people who used to operate high street shops, if they could make a living on the high street, then they can make a living online, perhaps even a better living using, say, Amazon's portal for their virtual storefronts. It's not a conspiracy. There's nothing underhand about it. It's just that that is where the shoppers are increasingly to be found. And the point is that COVID-19 is contributing to this change. Again, it's a catalyst. The complex crisis is driving the transformation, and the pandemic is speeding up things that were happening anyway, because the high street was failing and Amazon was rising long before COVID came along. And while I seem to be on the theme of defending Jeff Bezos, I'll make one other point, which is that you can see people criticizing Jeff Bezos for having so much money. And yes, you could take Jeff Bezos's $200 billion and distribute it among the world's 8 billion people, and everyone would be about $25 better off, which might buy them a meal out, let's say. And that, of course, is a fantasy anyway, because it's not $200 billion tucked in Jeff Bezos's wallet. Much of it is tied up in shares, property, and other investments. But the point is, if it were shared out, it would make little difference to the average person. But when it's all gathered together, it's possible to do extraordinary things with it. And Jeff Bezos is doing extraordinary things with it, with his space company Blue Origin and his plans to help humanity move beyond the Earth. And that will ultimately be of far more benefit to the human race than an extra $25 in everyone's pocket. So to come back to the point, COVID-19 is not an isolated phenomenon. It is a symptom and a cause of multiple forces reshaping today's world. Forces that involve the growth of both human numbers and human connectedness, and the stresses that arise from increasingly intensified interaction networks stretching across the planet. These stresses have also become manifest in other ways, such as political and environmental. And the pandemic is contributing to and catalysing a global historical transition that was already underway and has yet to complete its course, from the old industrial era to the future cybernetic era. And for this reason, we should expect that the pandemic is not a one-off event, but is the beginning of a deepening crisis that will unfold over the coming years. This crisis will likely involve further outbreaks of disease, some of which may be of greater seriousness and lethality than the present one, as well as interstate war, financial disruption, environmental disasters, and of course, domestic polarization, violence, conflict, and unrest. And although the pandemic and the wider crisis must end eventually, the world is not going to go back to the way it was before. And in due course, it will become apparent that the world has changed, not necessarily for better or worse, but in a profound and unmistakable way.